There was one word you could never say around R.G. LeTourneau. If you did, he slammed his fist on the table. The word was hydraulics. This was a man who held 299 patents. A man who built 70% of all Allied earth-moving equipment in World War II. A man who sold his entire scraper business to Westinghouse for $31 million in 1953, and then re-entered the industry at age 70 with machines that had no transmission, no drive shaft, and no differential. Just diesel engines and electric motors inside the wheels. His former partner Caterpillar thought he was finished, but both of them were about to find out that the 1950s scraper war would not be won by the company with the best machines. It would be won by the company that abandoned cable control first, and neither of them did it fast enough. This story covers 4 parts. First, how LeTourneau and Caterpillar became partners and then enemies. Second, the arms race that followed their breakup. Third, the 15-year battle between cable and hydraulic control that decided everything. And finally, the strange twist that made LeTourneau's greatest commercial failure into his most lasting contribution to the industry. To understand how this rivalry began, we need to go back to 1920. Robert Gilmore. LeTourneau was 32 years old. He had left school at 14, worked as a molder in an iron foundry, trained as an electrician at the Mare Island Navy Yard during the First World War, and drifted into the land-leveling business in Stockton, California. He bought a used Holt 75 tractor, and with the help of his brother-in-law, Ray Peterson, sketched his first scraper designs in the dirt driveway of his shop. LeTourneau filed his first patent in September 1922, patent number US 1,470,853. It described a telescoping bowl scraper that could double its capacity to 12 cubic yards. The United States Patent Office granted it on October 16, 1923. That single patent became the foundation of an empire. In 2004, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers designated it a historic mechanical engineering landmark. A scale model of an early carryall Model B scraper still sits in the Wheels of Time Museum in Peoria, Illinois. That model was built at LeTourneau's Stockton plant between 1939 and 1945, specifically for use in a lawsuit, though the details of that litigation have been largely lost to time. By the early 1930s, LeTourneau had developed something that changed the relationship between tractors and the dirt they moved. His cable power control units allowed an operator sitting on a Caterpillar tractor to raise, lower, and control a scraper bowl without ever leaving the seat. Before LeTourneau, controlling a scraper required a second man standing on the implement, pulling levers by hand, exposed to dust and danger. The cable power control unit eliminated that man, and it made Caterpillar tractors dramatically more useful. Caterpillar unnoticed. By the mid-1930s, more than 60% of all Caterpillar track-type tractors were shipped with LeTourneau attachments. Blades, cable controls, rippers, towed scrapers, all sold through Caterpillar's worldwide dealer network. The other major supplier was La Plante Choate, based in South Bend, Indiana. In 1935, LeTourneau moved his entire factory to Peoria, Illinois, at Caterpillar's invitation. He set up across the Illinois River from Caterpillar's East Peoria plant. The two companies were now neighbors, business partners, and deeply dependent on each other. By 1949, Caterpillar's East Peoria plant had 128 acres under roof. But in 1937, LeTourneau walked into Caterpillar's headquarters with a proposal that would destroy everything. He wanted to build a self-propelled, rubber-tired scraper, a machine that did not need a crawler tractor at all, a machine that could haul dirt at 20 miles per hour instead of 5. The economics were devastating for the old way of doing things. A bulldozer cost about 50 cents per cubic meter on the first push, but that cost rose rapidly with distance. 6 pushes brought the cost above $5 per cubic meter. A motor scraper cost about $1.20 per cubic meter at minimum cycle distance and could triple its haul length from 130 meters to 400 meters for almost no additional cost increase. Caterpillar's management told LeTourneau his idea was not feasible. The real reason was simpler. A self-propelled scraper would cannibalize crawler tractor sales, and crawler tractors were Caterpillar's entire business. So LeTourneau built it himself. He called it the Tournapull. The Model A used a Caterpillar D 17,000 V8 engine, producing 160 horsepower, mounted on a 2-wheeled tractor unit with a laterally offset engine and operator seat. It was a design unlike anything the industry had seen. He filed the foundational Tournapull patent as U.S. Patent 2,454,070. Only 20 to 25 A3 units were built before the war. But their first fleet deployment changed the industry forever. In 1938, 10 Model A1 Tournapulls were sent to the Hansen Dam project in Los Angeles. They moved 13 million cubic yards of earth. It was the first earth-moving project in history, done primarily by motor scrapers. The age of the crawler towed scraper was already dying, and Caterpillar had just refused to be part of the future. The story of LeTourneau's cable control system, which made all of this possible, is one of the most overlooked chapters in construction history. That system turned simple tractor operators into earth-moving specialists virtually overnight. If you are finding this story as fascinating as we were putting it together, take a second to like and subscribe so you do not miss the rest of this series. We cover the machines, the inventors, and the rivalries that built the modern world. When World War II began, LeTourneau's factories became the arsenal of earth-moving. The numbers are staggering. His plants in Peoria and Toccoa, Georgia produced 14,000 bulldozer blades, 10,000 carryall scrapers, 1,800 Tournapulls, and 1,600 sheepsfoot rollers. Between 70 and 75% of all Allied earth-moving equipment came from LeTourneau's factories. The Peoria and Toccoa plants collectively won the Army-Navy E Award 9 times. There were also machines that almost nobody knows about. The D4 airborne Tournapull was a military-only design, not a painted-over commercial machine. It was powered by a Continental Y112 gasoline engine producing just 44 horsepower with a capacity of 2 cubic yards. Only 567 units were ever built. Their purpose was extraordinary. They were designed to fit inside a Waco CG-4A glider or a C-47 transport aircraft, so that Army airborne aviation engineers could enlarge landing strips immediately after a combat drop. And on every American fleet aircraft carrier in the Pacific and Atlantic, LeTourneau Tournacranes served as the standard mobile crash crane, lifting disabled aircraft off flight decks. The Navy called them mobile crash cranes. LeTourneau's equipment was not just building roads and airfields, it was fighting the war. But the very success of the Tournapull created a problem that Caterpillar could not ignore. Every self-propelled scraper LeTourneau sold was a crawler tractor that Caterpillar did not sell. In 1944, with the tide of the war turning and post-war planning underway, Caterpillar made its move. They severed all supply agreements with both LeTourneau and LaPlante-Choate. The breakup devastated both suppliers. LaPlante-Choate's dealer network collapsed almost overnight. The company was eventually acquired by Alice Chalmers in 1953, the same year LeTourneau sold to Westinghouse. LaPlante-Choate was the company that actually coined the term motor scraper, which became the universal industry term for the machines LeTourneau had pioneered. The breakup left Caterpillar in a desperate position. They now needed to design and manufacture blades, scrapers, cable control units, and every attachment from scratch. Under the presidency of Louis B. Neumiller, a man who had started as a stenographer and blueprint clerk at Holt Manufacturing and risen to lead Caterpillar for over 2 decades. The company allocated massive resources to scraper development. Miller was famous for a motto he drilled into every engineer at the Peoria headquarters: ITABWODI. Is there a better way of doing it? Under his leadership, Caterpillar's revenues grew from $100 million in 1941 to $827 million by 1963. The first result of that investment was humble. In 1946, Caterpillar introduced the No. 70 Toad scraper. It was the first scraper Caterpillar had ever designed and manufactured entirely on its own. A No. 70 cost $12,715 new. The No. 40, a smaller toad scraper designed for the D4 tractor, became so popular with export customers that Caterpillar licensed its manufacture in 5 countries: Corpet Louvet in France, Wright Boag and Head in South Africa, Steelweld in Australia, Bertley in England. The Bertley name disappeared when Caterpillar took over United Kingdom production directly in 1963, absorbing the licensed operation into its own growing international manufacturing network. But a toad scraper was not what Caterpillar needed. They needed a self-propelled machine to compete directly with LeTourneau's Tournapull. That machine was the DW21. 5 years of intensive research produced a 2-wheel, single-axle motor scraper powered by a Caterpillar D337. Roots-blown diesel engine producing 225 horsepower. DW stood for diesel wheel. A working prototype was unveiled at ConExpo in Chicago in 1948, and by September 1950, the first production units were available for sale. Caterpillar invested in capabilities that went far beyond simple manufacturing. The company built an in-house soil bin at its facilities to test prototype scraper bowl profiles against different soil types. This level of research and development investment was unusual for the 1950s earthmoving industry, but it paid off. The testing led directly to the 1955 low bowl redesign that dramatically improved loading performance. The DW15C, introduced in 1954 with the low bowl scraper and a Caterpillar D326 engine producing 150 horsepower, sold 400 units in its first 2 years alone. Meanwhile, LeTourneau kept innovating, but his machines carried real danger alongside their engineering brilliance. The Model C Tournapull, introduced in April 1940, earned a grim nickname from the men who ran it. They called it the Widow Maker. Its clutch and brake steering was extremely dangerous on downhill grades. The machine could jackknife without warning. The later Super C that followed was safer, offering contractors a choice between Buda, Hercules, Cummins, or GM 671 engines producing 140 to 152 horsepower. The Super C became a staple of both military and civilian fleets through the late 1940s and into the 1950s. But perhaps the most remarkable Tournapull was the Model D. It entered production in 1946 and remained in production until 1973. It was a 25-year production run. It was only 8 feet wide, which meant it was legally roadable everywhere without requiring a special permit. Its 300-volt alternating current electric steering was innovative, but temperamental. Many operators, as one veteran mechanic recalled, came unstuck by idling into a turn and then finding no steering at all. The system required minimum engine revolutions per minute to generate sufficient voltage for the steering motors. Experienced operators learned this the hard way. The smell of burned electrical contacts became a constant companion. One mechanic who spent years maintaining Tournapulls recalled leaving equal amounts of skin in those machines, proving he knew what he was doing. The burned contacts had to be pulled out constantly, filed smooth, and put back in. "The smell would get on your hands," he said. and the wife complained about that more than the diesel smell. Caterpillar had its own problems. The DW21's early D337 engine suffered from cracked cylinder heads caused by exhaust back pressure. Caterpillar addressed the issue with a twin-stack exhaust modification around serial number 8UM061, and later adopted turbocharging. And then there was the Synchro Touch transmission. This was supposed to be a proto-power shift system for the DW20 and DW21 that would allow operators to shift on the move. The problem was that the mechanism was so sensitive to dirt contamination that it could select multiple gears simultaneously. When that happened, the gearbox destroyed itself. Every machine equipped with Synchro Touch was retrofitted with a standard 10-speed constant mesh transmission at Caterpillar's expense. Synchro Touch was quietly forgotten. The operators who ran these machines developed remarkable techniques to compensate for their limitations. Experienced DW21 operators discovered they could change gears without using the clutch by momentarily activating the cable control unit, which temporarily lugged the engine down just enough to allow the gear to slide home. This process was known as winch changing and was fairly widely employed on job sites across the country. It was the kind of skill that separated a good operator from a great one. The DW21 proved itself on construction sites around the world. At a demonstration near Barnsley, England, a DW21 completed a 500-yard haul cycle in under 12 minutes, moving shale overburden on a 1-in-8 gradient, while British contractors and government officials watched from the embankment. In Germany during the 1950s, where the motorway network that exists today had not yet been built, a convoy of 112 Caterpillar machines, including graders, DW21 scrapers, and D8 tractors, was driven nearly 250 kilometers on country roads from Bremerhaven to Dortmund. There was simply no highway to carry them on a trailer. In Kenya, DW21 scrapers helped build the Sasamua Dam, completed in 1956, which still provides drinking water to more than 10% of Nairobi's population. These were the machines that proved Caterpillar could compete in the motor scraper market without LeTourneau. An operator who ran DW21 scrapers for 24 years recalled that the 86E variant was the best, because more horsepower was always helpful to have. He said the steering system was excellent, and the machine steered like a Cadillac. But he also knew what killed the DW21. The 621 doomed them, he said, when speed became something everyone wanted to see. By 1953, LeTourneau had made a decision that shocked the entire industry. On May 1st, he sold his earth-moving equipment division to the Westinghouse Air Brake Company for $31 million. Wabuco had $93.6 million in 1952 sales and was seeking diversification beyond railroad equipment. The deal included all current earth-moving designs, 3 manufacturing plants in Peoria, Tocoa, and Rydalmere, Australia, and all associated patents and personnel. LeTourneau retained his Vicksburg, Mississippi, and Longview, Texas plants. He retained his corporate entity, and most importantly, he retained the electric wheel technology. A 5-year non-compete clause prevented him from building earth-moving equipment until 1957 or 1958. He also served as a consultant to LeTourneau Westinghouse during the transition period, which gave him a front-row seat to watch his former company struggle under new corporate ownership. Why did he sell? Because LeTourneau believed the electric wheel would make every other drive system obsolete. U.S. Patent number 2,726,726, filed on August 23, 1950, described an electric motor mounted directly inside a wheel hub. A floating drive pinion meshed with helical reduction gearing contained entirely within the wheel width. Each wheel could be independently driven, providing all-wheel drive and all-wheel steer without any mechanical drivetrain between the engine and the wheels. He eliminated the drive shaft, the differential, the transfer case, and the transmission entirely. He filed the patent simultaneously in Belgium and Great Britain. It took 5 years from filing to grant. LeTourneau had actually tried this concept before. In 1923, he built a self-propelled scraper with a gasoline engine, a dynamo, and 7 electric motors. It produced about 20 horsepower and moved at 1 mile per hour. The concept was right. The execution needed decades to mature. The 1923 machine used the same fundamental diesel-electric principle that would power the LT360 40 years later. But the 1923 version had perhaps 20 horsepower and crawled at walking speed, while the LT360 commanded 5,080 horsepower from 8 engines. What separated them was not the idea. It was materials science, manufacturing precision, and electrical engineering that simply did not exist in 1923. LeTourneau spent his entire career waiting for the rest of industry to catch up with what he already knew was possible. The sale created a new company called LeTourneau Westinghouse. Merle R. Yonts, LeTourneau's longtime vice president and treasurer, became president. The company standardized on General Motors and Cummins engines, fixed inherited electrical problems, and continued producing Model B, C, and D Tournapulls. In 1954, LeTourneau Westinghouse acquired J.D. Adams & Company, a respected motor grader manufacturer. In 1955, they hired a man named Ralph Kress to design what would become the Haulpak off-highway truck. Kress, an MIT graduate who had studied at night school from 1933 to 1939, would later be inducted into the National Mining Hall of Fame. The first Haulpak unit led the Thanksgiving Day parade in Peoria on its way to its first customer in 1957. If you have watched this far, you already know more about the scraper wars than 99% of equipment enthusiasts. Like and subscribe to stay with us through the rest of the story, because what happened next changed the entire construction industry. But LeTourneau Westinghouse's scraper sales stagnated. Despite the Interstate Highway Construction Program, which was the largest earth-moving project in history, with approximately 42 billion cubic yards of earth moved across roughly 46,000 miles, at a total cost of approximately $114 billion, LeTourneau Westinghouse's construction equipment sales reached only $76.5 million by 1965. That was barely up from LeTourneau's $55.5 million in 1952. As one equipment historian wrote, the most popular way of moving dirt on the interstates was scrapers. There were literally hundreds of scrapers working on these projects at any given time. Caterpillar benefited far more from the interstate boom than LeTourneau Westinghouse did. Caterpillar had a stable product line and a vastly superior dealer network during the crucial period from 1956 to 1965, while LeTourneau Westinghouse was still working through the corporate transition and struggling to differentiate its scraper line. LeTourneau Westinghouse was a weak third behind Caterpillar and Euclid, which had its own dramatic story as the dump truck pioneer that General Motors ultimately destroyed. The real question hanging over the 1950s was not whether Caterpillar or LeTourneau would win the scraper market. It was whether cable control or hydraulic control would become the industry standard. And the answer was available decades before either company was willing to accept it. Hydraulic scrapers had existed since 1936. In that year, Austin Western tested an all-hydraulic 12-yard scraper at the Moffett Coal Company in Sparta, Illinois. It worked, but the industry ignored it. Cable control was proven, cheap, and understood by every mechanic from Peoria to Perth. The problems with cable were well known. Cables snarled, kinked, and snapped without warning. There was no positive downward pressure on the bowl. Drums, sheaves, and limit switches demanded constant maintenance. One Army veteran who operated cable-controlled Tournapulls near Verdun, France in the early 1960s recalled that the winch could snap that cable like a shoestring. Loaded, you had to be careful going down a grade. because the machine would cross friction on you in a minute. But cable persisted. Caterpillar's number 40 towed scraper in 1949 was the company's first hydraulic-controlled scraper, designed for the small D4 tractor. The DW21 and DW20 motor scrapers, launched in 1950 and 1951, were entirely cable-controlled. The Euclid S7, introduced in 1954, was fully hydraulic for all bowl, apron, and ejector functions, and it proved remarkably durable. Operators said you could keep grease and oil in them, and they just kept going. The S7 remained virtually unchanged for a 17-year production run. But Euclid was a smaller player in scrapers. The two companies that dominated the market, Caterpillar and LeTourneau Westinghouse, both clung to cable. How long did they cling to it? The CAT 631A, introduced around 1960, had a modern power shift transmission, but every single bowl function was still cable-operated. As one historian noted, at a time when all of the major scraper manufacturers, except LeTourneau Westinghouse, had converted to full hydraulic control, Caterpillar was still firmly entrenched in the 1940s, utilizing all cable control. The most technologically advanced earth-moving company on Earth was using control technology from 2 decades earlier. The CAT 619B, introduced in 1959, was the first scraper to carry a 600 series designation. It was still cable-controlled. Its successor, the 619C, used a Caterpillar D344 cylinder engine that was never installed in any other Caterpillar earth mover before or since. It was a true orphan engine, built for one machine and one machine only, making the 619C a particular curiosity for collectors today. On major construction projects, CAT and LeTourneau Westinghouse machines often worked side by side. The St. Lawrence Seaway, built between 1954 and 1959, was the single largest concentration of heavy construction equipment in the decade. 210 million cubic yards of excavation, $1 billion in total cost, 22,000 workers at peak. CAT DW 21-wheel tractor scrapers were part of a fleet of more than 3,000 CAT machines on the Seaway. Major contractors including Peter Kiewit Sons, Morrison Knudsen, and Perini Corporation all ran mixed equipment fleets with both CAT and LeTourneau Westinghouse machines. On the Robinson Bay lock excavation, contractor Jack and Jim Master Incorporated chose scrapers instead of power shovels for the 120-foot deep excavation through boulder-strewn glacial till. The decision proved catastrophic. The contractor defaulted and was replaced by T-Con Corporation. It was one of many painful lessons about the limits of scrapers in heavy rock conditions. Caterpillar's new Joliet, Illinois plant, which opened in 1951 with more than 1 million square feet of manufacturing space and eventually employed 7,000 people at its peak, became the nerve center for hydraulic equipment development. The names of the engineers who worked there are preserved in patent records. Alan J. Hine and James E. Scheidt invented the hydraulic circuit for control of earth-moving scraper bowls. Patent US 3,127,688. John A. Junk and Joseph Koecheli developed the hydraulic valve neutralizer. Lawrence J. Miller patented the self-loading scraper with pivotal elevator. These were the men who made hydraulic scrapers work. The Joliet plant continued operating until June 30th, 2019, when Caterpillar closed it permanently after nearly 7 decades. The dam broke in the spring of 1962. Caterpillar launched 11 new 600 series motor scrapers in a single product announcement. The 631B, the 641, the 651, the 657, and the 660, all hydraulically controlled. The 631B alone sold over 4,000 units. Its successor, the 631C, sold over 5,500. The Cat 660, with its massive 40 cubic yard struck capacity and a loaded weight of 120 tons, capable of 40 to 45 miles per hour, was so specialized that only 109 units of the 90F series were ever built. LeTourneau Westinghouse responded with the C500, a modular Tournapull with electric switch controls instead of a steering wheel. It was an audacious design. The tractor and scraper could be separated and recombined with different attachments, but it was still cable and electric controlled in an industry that had embraced hydraulics. Fewer than 70 units were built before the C500 was discontinued in 1964. Wabco became the last major manufacturer to finally switch to hydraulic controls on their C-Series Tournapulls in the late 1960s. We spent weeks digging into the research for this story, and the part that surprised us most was what happened to the people involved. Like and subscribe if you want to see more stories about the machines and the men who pushed construction technology beyond what anyone thought possible. We cover these rivalries because the details matter. The scraper war was over. Caterpillar had won. But the human aftermath tells you everything about who really lost. Both key executives from LeTourneau Westinghouse ended up at Caterpillar. President Merle Yonts resigned in 1960, citing differences with the parent company over policy, and went to work for Caterpillar. Ralph Kress, the Hallpack designer, left WABCO for Caterpillar in 1962, where he designed Cat's 85-ton, 105-ton, and 240-ton electric drive mining trucks. When your president and your best engineer both defect to the competition, the war is truly over. The corporate aftermath reads like a cautionary tale about what happens when industrial companies change hands too many times. In 1968, WABCO was acquired by American Standard Incorporated. One historian wrote that one could logically ask what a bathroom fixture company inexperienced in capital goods was doing in the off-highway truck business. The LeTourneau name was suppressed and replaced by WABCO. By the early 1980s, WABCO exited the earth-moving and scraper business entirely. In 1984, American Standard sold the construction and mining equipment division to Dresser Industries for $66.3 million. Komatsu eventually acquired everything. But the man who lost the scraper war had surprises left. During his 5-year non-compete period, LeTourneau pivoted to something completely unexpected. In 1956, he built the Scorpion, the world's first mobile offshore jack-up drilling platform, at his Vicksburg plant. His first customer was a young Texas oilman named George Herbert Walker Bush, whose Zapata Offshore Company advanced $400,000, refundable if the platform did not work. The initial jacking system failed, and saltwater seeped into the gearboxes. But LeTourneau fixed it within a month. Bush ordered a second platform called the Vinegaroon in 1957. By 1970, the LeTourneau name was on more than half the drilling platforms in the world. When the non-compete expired in 1958, LeTourneau re-entered the earth-moving business at age 70. But he had not been idle during those 5 years. In addition to building offshore drilling platforms, he had pursued one of the most extraordinary military contracts of the Cold War. The United States Army needed vehicles that could haul supplies across the Arctic tundra to remote, distant early warning line radar stations. LeTourneau's answer was the overland train. The VC-22 Snow Freighter, delivered in February 1955 under a contract signed with Western Electric and General Electric, was 274 feet long and powered by twin Cummins NHV-12BI V12 diesel engines driving 24 electric wheel motors. It could haul 500 tons across frozen ground. The earlier TC-264 snow buggy, funded by the Army's Transportation Research and Development Command, rode on 8 tires that were 10 feet in diameter and was powered by a World War II-era Allison V-1710 V12 aircraft engine running on butane. Those enormous Firestone tires had an unexpected second life. In the 1980s, a junkyard owner sold them to Bob Chandler, who mounted them on Bigfoot 4 and Bigfoot 5, creating some of the most famous monster trucks in history. By 1958, LeTourneau was ready to return to Earthmoving. Not with cable-controlled scrapers, not with hydraulic machines, with all-electric wheel vehicles that had no mechanical drivetrain at all. His engineers built the electric LT360, the largest scraper ever constructed. It was 200 feet long, powered by 8 Detroit diesel 16 V71N engines, producing a combined 5,080 horsepower, riding on 8 tires that were 122 inches tall, each containing an electric traction motor. 3 scraper bowls held 72 cubic yards apiece. It was magnificent, and it resulted in 0 sales. The machine was simply too large for any practical construction operation. On an Idaho and Montana interstate project in the late 1960s, a LeTourneau L90 triple scraper worked alongside Cat and Johnson 621s and Terex scrapers. One operator's son recalled that the L90 shamed the Cat 621s and the Terex machines when it was running. But it weighed so much that the locations where it could actually operate were severely limited. The man who ran the first one, known to his family as Corky, passed away without leaving many details about the experience. His son went searching for information about the machine on equipment forums years later. And here is the final twist that makes this story complete. The company LeTourneau retained after the 1953 sale, the Vicksburg and Longview operation, focused on electric wheel technology, followed its own corporate chain through Marathon, Rowan Companies, LeTourneau Technologies, Joy Global, and finally, Komatsu. The earth-moving division he sold followed its own path through WABCO, American Standard, Dresser Industries, and finally, Komatsu. Both halves of the 1953 split were reunited under Komatsu more than 60 years later. LeTourneau employees at the Longview, Texas plant even used company machines to help construct portions of Interstate 20 being built just south of their factory. Today, Caterpillar is the only manufacturer on Earth still building wheel tractor scrapers. The 621, 631, 637, 651, and 657s carry forward a lineage that began with the DW21 in 1950, which itself was built because Caterpillar rejected LeTourneau's Tournapull idea in 1937, and then spent 6 years trying to replicate it. The military connection continued long after the 1950s. The LeTourneau Westinghouse CT4 scraper, paired with a Caterpillar 830M wheel dozer, a military-only model with no civilian equivalent, served extensively in Vietnam. The CT4 and 830M combination remained in service until 1985, when the United States Army purchased Caterpillar 621B scrapers as replacements. In 2010, Caterpillar won a $641.2 million contract for 621G scrapers for the Department of Defense, covering up to 909 units over 10 years. It was described as the largest single award Caterpillar had ever received from the United States military. But LeTourneau had the last word. Every ultra-class mining truck on Earth weighing more than 150 tons uses diesel-electric drive. The Komatsu 930E, introduced in 1996 as the industry's first AC electric wheel drive truck, is a direct descendant of the WABCO Haulpak line that originated in LeTourneau's Peoria factory. Modern LeTourneau wheel loaders under the Komatsu name use diesel-electric systems that consume up to 40% less fuel than mechanical drive equivalents. The concept that produced 1 mile per hour with 7 electric motors in a California dirt lot in 1923 now moves billions of tons of ore every year across 6 continents. R.G. LeTourneau died on June 1, 1969, at age 80. He held 299 patents. He had left school at 14 and received his only diploma, an honorary engineering degree, at age 76. When they handed it to him, he reportedly said, "So now I have got a diploma. Now I am educated." He gave 90% of his income to Christian causes and lived on the remaining 10%. He called it the reverse tithe. He once said that the question is not how much of my money I give to God, but how much of God's money I keep for myself. He was right about electric drive. He was wrong about hydraulics. And the word he could not bring himself to say was the word that decided the scraper wars. The machines have changed. The fundamental question has not. In every generation of construction equipment, there comes a moment when the old technology still works, but the new technology works better. The companies that survive are the ones that recognize that moment. The companies that dominate are the ones that act on it first. Caterpillar acted on hydraulics 26 years after Austin Western proved it could work. LeTourneau never acted on it at all, and both of them changed the world anyway.